I remember the exact moment my world tilted sideways. My parents had just handed my brother the keys to a $950,000 house, a mansion that gleamed in the sunlight, complete with a pool, a home theater, and every luxury they could dream of giving him. I sat on the couch, my hands trembling, trying to smile as they praised him for being their successful, responsible child. And there I was, invisible, my years of sacrifices and quiet struggles erased by their blind favoritism. Every promotion I'd worked for, every late night I'd stayed to help the family without a word of thanks, seemed to vanish into thin air. I felt a tight knot of anger and disbelief, my chest heavy with resentment I had carried silently for decades. How could they overlook me, yet shower him with everything I'd ever dreamed of? I wanted to speak, to argue, to demand recognition. But I just sat there, swallowed by a hollow, bitter awe, realizing the imbalance wasn't just money. It was love, attention, and approval that had always been his. Never mind. My stomach churned as I wondered if this was all I would ever be. The forgotten child, watching in silence as my brother received the life I had quietly earned in effort alone. I never expected them to show up unannounced. Not today, not ever. The knock at the door was sharp, insistent, and when I opened it, there they were, my parents, smiling as if they'd come for a friendly visit. I barely had time to greet them before my father leaned casually against the doorway and said, "We've been thinking about your house." My heart sank. I blinked, hoping I had misheard. "Your house?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes," my mother chimed in, her tone light, almost playful. "It's really time you consider our plans. We might need to take it over." I froze, shock rooting me to the floor. "Take it, but it's mine. I worked for this, I pay the bills, the mortgage, everything." My father waved a hand dismissively. Details. You'll understand when we explain everything." Anger boiled in my chest, mixing with disbelief. I couldn't imagine how they thought this was acceptable. Fear slithered in too. The thought of losing my stability, my sanctuary, my life's work. I opened my mouth to argue, but words failed me, replaced by a rising panic. They smiled, oblivious or uncaring, and I realized I needed a plan. Fast. The weight of the situation pressed down, leaving me trapped between outrage and helplessness, teetering on the edge of a decision I didn't yet know how to make. As they left me reeling at the doorstep, my mind drifted back, unwillingly, to years of being the invisible one. Birthdays that went unnoticed while my brother's parties were extravagant, complete with balloons, catered food, and endless praise. I could still hear my mother cooing over his accomplishments, while my own successes were met with a nod or a passing, "Good job, dear." Every grade I earned, every promotion I celebrated quietly, seemed to vanish into a void they refused to acknowledge. I remembered the science fair in 5th grade, how I stayed up all night crafting my model volcano, only for my father to comment, "Well, at least it's better than your brother's last project." I had tried to speak up, to assert myself, but my words always fell flat against their unwavering favoritism. Even small things, like helping around the house or caring for a sick relative, were overlooked, while any gesture my brother made became monumental in their eyes. The pattern was clear. He was worthy, I was expendable. Those memories mingled with the sting of today, creating a knot of resentment and sorrow that had never fully untangled. I realized that my anger wasn't just about a house. It was about decades of being unseen, unheard, and unvalued. The injustice of it all gnawed at me, making the casual threat at my door feel like the latest chapter in a lifelong story of neglect and erasure. Every overlooked effort, every ignored milestone, added fuel to a fire that was now demanding action. And for the first time, I acknowledged it. I would no longer be the background in their carefully curated family narrative. A few days later, they returned, this time armed with certainty and a carefully rehearsed plan. My father didn't waste words. "It's simple," he said, voice calm but carrying an edge that made my stomach clench. "Sign over the house to us or face the consequences." I stared at him, disbelief and rage twisting inside me. "Consequences," I echoed, my voice sharper than I intended. My mother leaned in, sweet and venomous at once. "You know what we mean. We've done so much for you, and now it's time to do the right thing." Their smiles were thin masks hiding a quiet threat. Legal action, emotional guilt, family manipulation. I could feel it all closing in. The potential court battles, the shame of being portrayed as selfish, the whispers of relatives taking their side. I paced the living room, my mind a storm. Part of me wanted to fight, to protect everything I'd built with my own hands. Another part hesitated, terrified of the fallout, of being cut off, humiliated, or made to feel guilty for daring to resist. I weighed every option, every possible outcome, my pulse racing with the enormity of their ultimatum. Could I risk confrontation and anger them further? Or would silence and compliance save me from immediate pain, but at the cost of my independence? The tension tightened around me like a noose, leaving me with one inescapable truth. Whatever choice I made, the consequences would shape my life forever. And for the first time, I realized that standing up for myself would require more courage than I ever thought I had. I spent the next few days in a haze of worry and sleepless nights, but I refused to act recklessly. Quietly, I reached out to friends I trusted, those who had always been my anchors, explaining the situation in hushed tones. Their shock mirrored my own, but their support gave me a sliver of hope. I also scheduled meetings with a lawyer and a financial advisor, desperate to understand the boundaries of what they could legally demand and what protections I might have. Sitting in the sterile office of the lawyer, I felt a mixture of fear and determination. Every word about trusts, ownership rights, and loopholes felt like a lifeline thrown into turbulent waters. I scribbled notes furiously, heart pounding, imagining the look on my parents' faces if I were able to outmaneuver them. A small spark of satisfaction flared at the thought. Could I quietly take control, turn their assumptions against them, and protect what was mine? The idea was risky, but it stirred something I hadn't felt in years. A sense of agency, a glimmer of empowerment. I knew the game had shifted. I was no longer just the powerless child. They had underestimated me, and soon they would realize it. Late one evening, I sat at my kitchen table, papers strewn around me, staring at the possibilities that had just opened up. My lawyer had pointed out a series of loopholes, legal technicalities, ownership clauses, and trust arrangements that could protect my house from my parents' grasp. I felt a rush of adrenaline mixed with disbelief. Could it really be this simple to reclaim control over a situation that had felt impossible just days ago? My heart pounded as I imagined the tension on their faces when they realized their threats were no longer valid. For the first time in years, I felt an intoxicating sense of power, calm, steady, and controlled. I traced the steps carefully, mapping out exactly how I would act when the time came, feeling the thrill of a quiet, cunning victory forming in my mind. Outside, the night was still, the world unaware, and in that silence, I felt the first real taste of agency. They had assumed I would cower, that I would bend under pressure. But now the tables were slowly turning, and I could almost hear the unspoken panic they would feel when their control slipped from their grasp. The suspense coiled tightly in my chest, and yet, I relished it, savoring the moment before the storm of confrontation would inevitably arrive. When they returned, they carried the same smug confidence as before, as if the house and my compliance were already theirs. My father's smile was casual, my mother's laugh light and dismissive, and I felt the old familiar tension coil in my chest. "So have you thought about our offer?" my father asked, leaning against the doorway. "I've thought about it," I replied evenly, keeping my voice calm despite the storm inside me. My mother tilted her head, pretending curiosity. "And what do you think?" I let a small, knowing smile slip, something they hadn't seen in years. "I think there are other ways to handle this," I said softly, letting the words hang in the air, heavy with implication. Their confident expressions flickered for a split second, though they masked it quickly. My heart raced with excitement at the tiny crack I had just created. Conversation flowed, full of veiled threats and polite interrogations, and I answered carefully, dropping subtle hints that I was informed, prepared, and not as powerless as they assumed. By the time they left, their eyes betrayed unease beneath practiced composure. I watched them drive away, a slow smile forming on my lips. The first seeds of doubt had been planted, and though I knew they would regroup and strategize, I felt a thrilling sense of control. The next move would be theirs, and I would be ready. I spent the next few days quietly putting my plan into motion, each step deliberate, calculated, and satisfying in a way that made my pulse race. The lawyer had prepared a series of documents, trusts, pre-signed contracts, and protective clauses that ensured my ownership was ironclad. I signed papers with steady hands, feeling the thrill of finally asserting control over what had always been mine. At the same time, I called a few close friends and colleagues who could subtly influence perception, creating a social shield that would make any public challenge from my parents risky and embarrassing for them. I was no longer the timid, overlooked child who had sat silently at family dinners, ignored and dismissed. I was deliberate, strategic, and in command. Every signature, every call, every small action built a fortress around my life, one they could not penetrate. I imagined their shock when they realized that their familiar tactics, pleading, threats, guilt-tripping, would no longer work. I felt a fierce satisfaction as the contrast between who I had been and who I had become crystallized. The same person they had underestimated for years, now untouchable, powerful, and unafraid. The sense of empowerment was intoxicating, and yet, beneath it all, a careful patience settled in. I would let them think the game was still theirs, biding my time for the perfect moment to reveal that the tables had turned completely. The day their plan began to unravel started innocuously enough. My parents arrived at my door, brimming with the same overconfidence that had become their signature, fully expecting me to panic or comply. Instead, they were met with calm, quiet assurance. A few friends who had been looped in subtly started pointing out inconsistencies, offhand comments about property boundaries, mortgage payments, and neighborhood chatter that highlighted their misunderstanding of the situation. Even neighbors, previously loyal to the family's image, noticed things didn't add up, and whispers began to circulate. My parents' attempts to intimidate me fell flat. The legal groundwork I had laid rendered their threats impotent, and every move they made only emphasized their ignorance and hubris. I watched from the sidelines as their carefully rehearsed facade cracked, small signs of frustration and embarrassment flickering across their faces. For the first time, I felt a deep, intoxicating satisfaction, not just in protecting my home, but in seeing the people who had spent decades undermining me start to lose their grip. The power dynamic had shifted completely. I was no longer the child who swallowed indignities in silence. I was the architect of the game now, quietly observing as my parents' social and emotional miscalculations became obvious to everyone around them. Their confidence faltered, replaced by visible tension and awkward attempts at damage control, while I stood firm, composed, and in full control. The thrill of seeing years of underestimation dissolve into public vulnerability was unlike anything I had ever felt. The house was secure, my dignity intact, and I knew the final confrontation would only cement this reversal, leaving them shocked, humiliated, and powerless. When they returned for the third time, their confidence was almost comical, as if repetition alone would bend me to their will. "You really think you can outsmart us?" My father sneered, his tone laced with disbelief. "It's just a house after all," my mother added, attempting to smile, though tension betrayed her words. I stood calmly, letting their words wash over me, my heart steady and my mind sharp. "It's more than a house," I replied evenly. "It's my life, my work, and my decisions. And I won't let anyone, especially you, take it from me." Their expressions faltered as I handed them copies of the finalized legal documents, the trusts, the ownership clauses and notarized protections I had quietly arranged. Every loophole they had hoped to exploit had been sealed, every argument they could have made rendered useless. I watched their eyes widen in disbelief as reality sank in. They had been outmaneuvered completely. For the first time in decades, I felt true vindication. The child they dismissed, the one they thought powerless, had orchestrated a flawless reversal. Neighbors who had gathered for a casual check-in noticed the shift. Friends who had been subtly involved shared discreet nods of recognition. My parents' composure crumbled under the undeniable weight of the facts, their threats now hollow and impotent. The tension that had gripped me for weeks released in a flood of triumph, satisfaction, and righteous indignation. I let the silence stretch, giving them time to absorb the full scope of their failure. Every slight, every overlooked accomplishment, every whispered comparison between my brother and me. The tables had turned, and I was firmly in control. When they finally stumbled away, retreating in shock and humiliation, I realized that this victory wasn't just about the house. It was about reclaiming my worth, my dignity, and the respect I had long been denied. The justice was public, undeniable, and deeply satisfying, leaving me exhilarated, proud, and finally at peace with the power I had quietly harnessed. After the storm had passed, I finally sank into the quiet of my living room, the weight of weeks of tension lifting slowly from my shoulders. I thought about the betrayal, the years of favoritism, the blatant disregard for my efforts, and the way my parents had tried to manipulate me even now. But as I reflected, a profound sense of pride began to bloom. I had faced fear, anger, and uncertainty, and I had come out not only intact but stronger. For the first time, I recognized the depth of my own resilience, the careful planning, the courage to stand firm, and the intelligence to navigate a family system that had long seemed impenetrable. Independence had never felt so sweet, and the quiet empowerment of knowing I could protect myself and my home filled me with warmth and confidence. I allowed myself a moment of gratitude for the friends and advisors who had supported me, realizing that alliances and careful strategy mattered just as much as courage. The contrast between the chaos of confrontation and the calm now surrounding me made the victory feel even more complete. My parents had underestimated me for decades, and yet here I was, steady, composed, and fully in command of my life. In that serene aftermath, I could finally breathe, feeling a deep satisfaction that came not just from winning, but from finally claiming the respect, dignity, and self-worth that had always been mine. Word spread quietly at first, then more openly. My parents' attempts to manipulate me had failed, and the ripple effects began to show. Whispers of their overreach reached relatives and neighbors, leaving them red-faced and fumbling for explanations. My brother, who had long enjoyed favoritism and applause, now had to witness the public unraveling of the family dynamic he had taken for granted. I remembered the countless times I had swallowed humiliation, the birthday parties ignored, the praise directed solely at him, and it all crystallized in sharp contrast to this moment. Karma, it seemed, had a patient hand, and justice had arrived quietly but undeniably. My parents' credibility eroded with each passing conversation, each raised eyebrow from friends or colleagues who had finally glimpsed the truth. The shame was subtle but persistent, internalized in ways they could neither control nor deflect. I felt no gloating, only a steady satisfaction, a recognition that decades of underestimation had been corrected. The past and present collided in my mind. The overlooked child versus the woman who now stood strong, triumphant, and unassailable. Every slight they had inflicted now mirrored back on them, a silent reckoning that emphasized the fairness of the outcome. Sitting quietly in my home, I reflected on everything I had endured, the favoritism, the betrayals, and the constant feeling of being overlooked. Those experiences had shaped me, teaching patience, resilience, and the importance of trusting my instincts. I realized that my worth had never depended on my parents' approval or my brother's success. It had always been mine to claim. Planning carefully, standing firm, and asserting myself had not only protected my home, but also reaffirmed my confidence and independence. I had learned that power often comes quietly, through knowledge, strategy, and self-respect, rather than force or anger. The emotional scars from the past still lingered, but they no longer defined me. Instead, they served as reminders of the strength I had cultivated. I hoped that anyone listening or watching would take away the importance of valuing oneself, standing up for what is right, and embracing the courage to reclaim control when others underestimate you. In that clarity, I felt a profound sense of closure, a quiet triumph that was entirely my own. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected invitation to a neighborhood gathering, a casual event, but one buzzing with whispers about my independence and the clever way I had handled everything. People I had barely spoken to approached with genuine admiration, congratulating me quietly but warmly. Even distant relatives who had once dismissed my achievements seemed hesitant to speak, caught between embarrassment and awe. I couldn't help but smile, imagining my parents' faces if they knew just how far-reaching the news had spread. It was a subtle victory, small yet undeniable, respect and recognition coming to me on my terms, without confrontation, without fanfare, just the quiet acknowledgement of my triumph. That satisfaction, mingled with a knowing sense of FOMO for those who had underestimated me, left me with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. I had not only protected my home and dignity, but also carved a space where my voice, choices, and worth could never again be ignored. It was the perfect, satisfying conclusion. Justice had been served, silently but powerfully, leaving both relief and lingering awe in its wake.